Madison Roosevelt stood in her sprawling garden on a crisp Monday morning in late September, her striking yellow hair catching the early sunlight as she wrapped her elegant purple cardigan tighter around herself while holding a steaming cup of organic coffee, admiring the magnificent oak tree that had been standing in her backyard for nearly 2 centuries and had become her most cherished possession since moving to the prestigious Meadowbrook Heights community 5 years ago. Hey everyone, welcome back to HOA Backdoor Stories. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Before we start, let me know in the comments, what country are you watching from? And what's your HOA horror story? Let's jump into today's episode. The ancient tree had transformed into her sanctuary, a place where she would spend countless late evening hours reviewing environmental law cases for her respected private practice. Sitting on the weathered bench beneath its sprawling branches that seemed to embrace the entire property like protective arms reaching toward an endless sky. This particular morning, a crisp white envelope adorned with the official HOA seal was waiting in her mailbox, and as she carefully opened it with trembling fingers while still holding her coffee mug, her heart began to race at the devastating words printed in formal legal language. Notice of mandatory tree removal. 14 days to comply. Violation of community standards and aesthetic guidelines. Failure to comply results in $5,000 monthly fines. The letter was signed by Marcus Sterling, the imperious HOA president who had made no secret of his ambitious plans to transform Meadowbrook Heights into an ultra-modern, sterile community where every tree was uniform in size and species, explaining with corporate efficiency that the oak tree was deemed unsightly due to its age, posed potential safety hazards, and violated the community's landscape ordinance that required all mature trees to be professionally assessed for removal eligibility and replaced with approved saplings that would take decades to mature. Victoria's initial shock transformed into methodical determination as her legal mind kicked into gear, and she immediately began investigating, discovering through county records and university databases that the oak was not merely a beautiful tree, but a Quercus alba, or white oak, serving as critical habitat for 17 different species of endangered organisms, including the rare elytral beetle protected under federal law. Her research revealed that environmental scientists had documented this very tree as significant since 1987, with a full dissertation written about its ecological importance, and most shockingly, she uncovered HOA meeting minutes from 2 years prior, in which Marcus Sterling himself had acknowledged the tree's protected status while dismissing it as irrelevant to community aesthetics. The realization hit Madison with the force of a hammer. The HOA president knew exactly what he was doing, knowingly violating federal environmental protection laws and betting that homeowners would be too intimidated or uninformed to challenge his authority, making this not merely a property dispute but a potential felony involving conspiracy to destroy protected habitat and endangered species. Madison made the pivotal decision to represent herself as her primary counsel while assembling a formidable team that included Dr. James Chen from the State University's Environmental Science Department, investigative journalist Sarah Mitchell, whose reporting had exposed corporate environmental violations, and eventually federal environmental protection attorneys who recognized the magnitude of the legal violation occurring in this small community. She moved with professional precision and urgency, filing an emergency injunction in state court complete with 300 pages of supporting documentation, including scientific reports, species surveys, photographs of the endangered insects living within the tree's ecosystem, expert testimony about the tree's irreplaceable ecological value, and detailed analysis of how the HOA's planned removal would constitute a direct violation of the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. The injunction was granted within 72 hours, temporarily halting the removal and sending shockwaves through the HOA office as Sterling and his legal team scrambled to file counter motions, arguing that local property ordinances should supersede federal environmental protection laws, an argument that federal judges have consistently rejected for the past 50 years. Madison collaborated with Dr. Chen to conduct comprehensive environmental surveys of the property, documenting each endangered species present on the tree, collecting specimens for laboratory analysis, and creating detailed maps showing how the tree served as a critical corridor connecting 3 separate conservation areas across the region's fragmented ecosystem. Sarah Mitchell produced a compelling investigative segment for the local news station that showed Madison standing beside her ancient tree in her distinctive purple dress with her striking yellow hair glowing in the golden sunset light, speaking eloquently about the scientific importance of environmental protection and the dangers of HOA overreach, a segment that went viral across social media platforms within hours and garnered over 2 million views. The story caught the attention of major national news organizations, environmental groups, and federal agencies, with the EPA launching a formal investigation into whether the HOA had violated the Endangered Species Act by attempting to destroy critical habitat without proper federal permits or environmental impact assessments, while the Department of Justice assembled a task force to examine potential criminal violations of environmental protection statutes. The federal investigation uncovered a paper trail of deliberate obstruction and environmental law violations that shocked even seasoned environmental prosecutors, revealing that HOA staff had received multiple environmental impact reports dating back to 2019, reports that had been systematically removed from public records, buried in locked file cabinets in Sterling's office, and deliberately excluded from any community meetings or official discussions where homeowners might have access to the information. Investigators obtained Sterling's email communications through a grand jury subpoena, and what emerged was a devastating chronicle of environmental crimes, internal emails from 2019 discussing how to quietly eliminate the problem tree before environmental groups can interfere, references to paying off board members who expressed environmental concerns, and explicit acknowledgement that removing the tree would violate federal law, but the assumption that nobody would find out because HOA decisions rarely get federal scrutiny. One particularly damning email from Sterling to Board Treasurer Robert Morrison stated, "We know about the protected species issue, but the tree needs to go for property values. Let's handle this quietly before anyone can stop us." Another email chain revealed that Sterling had consulted with an environmental lawyer who explicitly warned him that tree removal would violate federal law, and Sterling's response was to stop communicating with that lawyer and instead hire a real estate attorney who gave him the opinion he wanted to hear. The evidence was so compelling and the violations so egregious that federal prosecutors immediately expanded their investigation from civil environmental violations to potential criminal conspiracy charges, with Sterling and 3 board members facing possible prison time if convicted. Madison filed an amended civil complaint seeking $15 million in damages, the original tree valuation of $1 million, plus additional amounts for emotional distress, legal fees, environmental restoration costs, and punitive damages reflecting the deliberate and willful nature of the environmental crimes. The HOA's insurance company, recognizing that a jury would almost certainly award the full amount given the clear evidence of intentional environmental law violation, began serious settlement negotiations that eventually resulted in a tentative offer of $12 million plus implementation of sweeping environmental protection reforms throughout the community. The national media coverage of Madison's case transformed what had started as a private property dispute into a defining story about environmental justice and corporate accountability, with major television networks, newspapers, and online publications running extensive investigations into the broader pattern of HOA abuses that had been occurring across the country for decades without significant legal consequences. Madison appeared on major morning talk shows, her composed demeanor and expert legal knowledge presenting a stark contrast to the bumbling HOA board members who appeared in subsequent segments, looking flustered and unprepared, and her interviews resonated with millions of homeowners who suddenly realized they had unknowingly surrendered enormous power to boards with minimal accountability. Environmental organizations mobilized their membership around the case, with the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, and smaller local land trusts filing amicus curiae briefs supporting Madison's position and arguing that the case represented a critical opportunity to establish legal precedent protecting environmental rights against HOA overreach. State legislators began receiving constituent complaints about HOA authority, prompting several state environmental agencies to announce investigations into whether existing HOA regulations complied with state and federal environmental protection laws, with some states indicating they would propose new legislation limiting HOA power to remove or significantly alter environmental features on residential properties. The story had become so prominent in national environmental law circles that law schools began using Madison's case as a teaching example in environmental law courses, and legal scholars published articles analyzing the broader implications of the case for the intersection of property rights and environmental protection. Marcus Sterling, facing multiple felony charges mounting legal bills exceeding $500,000, immense personal humiliation, and the likely prospect of significant prison time, authorized his lawyers to engage in serious plea negotiations with federal prosecutors, ultimately agreeing to plead guilty to 3 counts of conspiracy to violate the Endangered Species Act in exchange for the government's agreement not to pursue additional charges related to obstruction of justice and making false statements to federal investigators. The settlement agreement that was finalized in mid-November represented far more than simple financial compensation, as it included revolutionary provisions that would fundamentally transform how the HOA operated, including the requirement that any future landscaping decisions be subject to comprehensive environmental review by qualified environmental professionals before being approved by the board, mandatory quarterly environmental audits of all community properties to identify and protect significant natural features, the creation of an Environmental Protection Committee with authority to veto any board decision that might harm protected species or critical habitats, and the implementation of a transparent public record system where all environmental documents would be made freely available to residents. Madison worked intensively with environmental law specialists to draft comprehensive new HOA bylaws that were so thorough and protective of environmental rights that they were eventually adopted by over 300 other HOA communities across the United States, and professional organizations began recognizing her model as the gold standard for balancing property rights with environmental protection responsibilities. The restored oak tree, with its 200-year history now celebrated rather than condemned, became an international symbol of environmental protection and citizen activism, and a bronze plaque was installed at its base commemorating its historical significance and its crucial role as critical habitat for endangered species, with the plaque designed so that the sunlight would catch it at just the right angle to remind people of the value of preserving nature. Madison's law practice expanded dramatically as her phone rang constantly with calls from homeowners across the country facing their own battles with overzealous HOAs, and she established a new division of her firm dedicated exclusively to environmental protection and HOA reform, eventually establishing a nonprofit legal defense fund to provide free representation to homeowners who could not afford attorneys. The criminal trial of Marcus Sterling unfolded over 6 weeks, with federal prosecutors presenting the devastating email evidence, expert testimony from Dr. Chen about the tree's ecological significance, testimony from the former board members who had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, and analysis from environmental law experts about the clear violations of federal environmental statutes. Sterling's defense team argued that he had relied on advice from his attorneys regarding the legality of the tree removal, but the emails showing he had intentionally disregarded contrary legal advice made his defense essentially futile, and the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, resulting in a sentencing of 3 years in federal prison and $1 million in restitution to environmental organizations, a sentence that Madison watched from the gallery while standing with Dr. Chen and journalist Sarah Mitchell, her yellow hair catching the light from the courtroom windows, and her purple blazer a striking reminder of her commitment to justice. In the years following the settlement and criminal trial, the environmental legacy of Madison's courageous stand rippled outward in ways that neither she nor anyone else could have anticipated, as the case inspired a national environmental movement focused on protecting trees, forests, and wildlife habitat from the arbitrary decisions of HOA boards and other local authorities that had previously operated with minimal oversight or accountability. Dr. James Chen established the Roosevelt Environmental Research Center at the university, named in honor of Madison's work, and the center became an internationally recognized facility for studying endangered species, conservation, and habitat restoration, with researchers from 12 countries working on projects examining how the century-old oak tree supported its complex ecosystem of endangered organisms and what lessons could be applied to protecting similar species elsewhere. The tree itself became something of a pilgrimage site for environmental scientists, conservationists, and activists from around the world who traveled to Meadowbrook Heights to stand beneath its ancient branches and contemplate the narrow margin by which environmental catastrophe had been averted, with visitors leaving notes of gratitude at the base of the tree, expressing how Madison's story had inspired them to become environmental advocates in their own communities. Madison's expanding law practice eventually grew to a full-service environmental firm with offices in 12 states, employing 47 attorneys and paralegals dedicated to fighting environmental violations and protecting the rights of ordinary citizens against corporate and governmental abuse, and she established scholarship programs for law students interested in environmental protection work. The settlement funds of $12 million were deployed strategically across the region for habitat restoration projects, including the purchase of threatened forest parcels, the establishment of wildlife corridors connecting fragmented ecosystems, and the funding of research programs examining how climate change might affect the survival of the endangered species that depended on the Meadowbrook oak, ensuring that Madison's legal victory would translate into tangible environmental improvement for decades to come. Legislative reforms inspired by the case fundamentally transformed HOA regulations in 37 states, with environmental protection provisions now standard in most HOA bylaws nationwide, and professional organizations began requiring environmental impact assessments as part of standard board training, recognizing that environmental stewardship was as much a responsibility of property managers as financial oversight. Madison continued her work with a quiet determination, spending her evenings beneath the ancient oak tree that had changed her life, her yellow hair now streaked with gray from the stress of the legal battle, but her eyes still bright with the knowledge that she had succeeded in protecting something precious and irreplaceable. And whenever young environmental lawyers would visit seeking advice about their own battles against environmental destruction, she would bring them to that tree and tell them the story of how one woman's commitment to justice and environmental protection could transform not just a community, but an entire nation's approach to preserving the natural world for future generations. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. See you in the next episode.